Okay, this is great slide to start on. Let's talk about sex. Okay, just to remind you, if you're forgetting where we left off on Wednesday, we had just finished talking about the basic principles of an evolutionary approach to studying human behavior. We had gone over natural selection. We talked about the whole idea of how this worked and what it meant to consider human behavior, human emotions from that kind of framework. And we had done this exercise to get you all thinking from the perspective of an evo psychologist, asking this big question, why? Is it possible that we could explain an impulse or preference that someone might have had, not just in terms of maybe experiences they had after they were born, but rather an innate predisposition that they were born with as a result of thousands of years of human history? Maybe certain impulses would have happened to make it more likely that genes would be passed on, and people who had that impulse passed it down. And we were trying to get you guys thinking from that perspective, thinking about the why of a lot of behavioral impulses that we have and preferences that we demonstrate. On that note, as you can see from the headline of the slide, I want to talk a little bit about sex. Why do I want to talk a little bit about sex? Well, I think I just want to give you a sampling of the kinds of questions that evo psychologists specifically have asked about human behavior and what answers they've come up with. Now, I should say that people thinking about human behavior from this perspective have asked questions in all sorts of domains that are very interesting, that range from why are we afraid of what we're afraid of, why are we grossed out by what we're grossed out by. But the reason I'm talking about a few of the findings related to sexual motivation is because by far most of the articles, or at least more of the articles that have been published from this perspective, deal with sexual motivation, mating behavior, attraction compared to other things. That's been the richest area of contribution that evo psychologists have made. And I just want to give you a little snapshot of how evo psychologists have used this framework we discussed to think about sex. As you probably know, sex is a basic motivation. It is not necessary on an individual level. In fact, just as a side note, there is a lot of variation in how motivated individuals feel to pursue sex at all, ranging from not at all to feeling very motivated. But we do know that it's necessary at the species level for the survival of the species. And that's why it's not surprising that we see the motivation to have sex driving a lot of what people do, and we see psychologists very interested in studying how this all plays out. Specifically, mate selection strategies are a really important motivation for a lot of behavior. How is it that people decide with whom they want to engage in this? And that is a lot of what evo psychologists have studied. And how quickly do they jump into sex versus how picky are they? And these are the kinds of things that evo psychologists have tried to address. And one of the primary findings here I just wanted to mention is that genders differ in their mate selection strategies. Of course, we're about to talk about a basic finding from the literature, and I want you to remember that we know that all males don't demonstrate what we're about to discuss, and all females don't either. But there is a pretty reliable, on average, difference that we find between males and females in the basic approach to mating that is demonstrated, and that's what I want to talk about. We're going to introduce this with a discussion of the very famous Clark and Hatfield study from 1978. Done in the late 70s, this is a really well-known, famous study because it really laid the groundwork for a lot of the discussion about human sexuality and how we can understand sexual motivation in terms of male-female differences. And as I describe the methods, you might also it might become apparent to you why this captured people's attention, why this was just an interesting and provocative study to read when you pick it up and you read the methods section of it. It got a lot of attention. This was actually done on the Florida State campus. And the setup was this. The researchers selected research assistants, a male research assistant and a female research assistant. And the researchers sent these RAs out onto campus, and their job was to approach people that they had never met and never spoken to, and quickly start a conversation and ask them one of 3 questions. We've talked about random assignment. You know what it is now. Random assignment determined which of 3 questions, basically which condition each of the participants that were approached on campus was going to be exposed to. And here were the 3 different questions. Participants approached by the RA either got asked, will you go out with me? Or they got asked, will you go back to my place with me? Or they got asked, will you have sex with me? Skip straight to the point. I mentioned we had a male RA and we had a female RA. The female RA was instructed to approach male students and the male RA to approach female students. As such, just as another side note, the authors of this study did this with the purpose of attempting to gain some insight into heterosexual sexual motivation. They do not make any claims that they are attempting to explain homosexual attraction as a result. So the male RA approached the females, female RA approached the males, and they were specifically selected for being of average physical appeal. The researchers didn't want to get kind of weird, out of the ordinary results by picking people that were extraordinarily below average or extraordinarily above average in terms of how they were rated physically. We have these average looking RAs. They approach these participants and they get asked one of 3 questions. When I'm there in person, I like to get a little feedback from the class on what they would predict would happen. Picture, this is a college campus, just like yours. Well, whether or not you feel FSU is a college campus just like yours, I don't know. It might be up for debate. But it's a college campus with undergrads, and people are showing up and asking these questions to people they don't know. What do you think would happen? Do you think there's a gender difference in how people would respond? Would you predict that you would see that same difference in the same direction across all 3 questions? Or that difference would only emerge on some of the questions but not others? Just think about what would be your instinct. And specifically, what percentage of people are going to say yes to this? I like to usually take a show of hands, get some people to volunteer their thoughts, because I find it very interesting what students would predict that other students would be doing here in this situation. I'm not there to do that, which makes me sad, but just kind of think to yourself, what would you predict? Here we have the results. Okay. If you look at this graph, you will, I mean, it's very striking, and one of the things that is really striking about it is how large the difference is, and we'll talk about the specifics here in a second. In psychology, oftentimes psychologists have different conditions, and they're comparing results across conditions, and sometimes they'll find very real differences between conditions where the difference is statistically significant and it's real, but it's small. And you have to talk about how important is it as a result. We have a lot of small effect sizes that we find sometimes. This is not a small effect size. This is a big effect size. This is a big difference between the males and the females here. And that's important to note, because something this huge, psychologists have to be talking about it. If you want to understand basic motivations that are going on with human behavior, if you're a social psychologist particularly, and you want to understand human interaction, you have to be talking about this. Let's break down what happened here. Just shy of 60% of males and females were saying, sure, I'll go out with you. Not a gender difference there. Oftentimes when I ask students, that surprises them. They predict a gender difference on all the questions. Not a big one there. You got undergrads, they're in the mode of meeting new people. Okay, it'll be safe, it'll be a public place. It feels awkward to say no to someone. Why would I say no to someone I don't know? They could be a new friend. Hey, why not? Sure, yeah, I mean, I'll go do something with you. People don't, there's not a marked difference there. Where you start to see the divergence, of course, is when they're asked by somebody that they've never spoken to you, will you go back to my place with me? And here's where we see the percentage of females saying yes to this is now dropping off. Not so with the males. And of course, the third question is the huge difference. We're just shy of 80% of the males who are approached by somebody they have never spoken to are saying, yes, let's have sex. Not a single female in the whole study says yes to this question. Not a single one. And that is a difference that is important to understand what is going on there. Psychologists should want to get that. I often ask people if they think we'd get the same results if we replicated the study now, because this is a sensible question to ask. We have had a shift in some of our sexual norms and expectations about sexual behavior within society. And we might not get the exact same results if we did this particular procedure again. But I should mention that much more recently, all sorts of research has still been done investigating mating behavior, and we do know that there still is a real, on average, gender difference in how people answer questions about things like, when would you first have sex? How quickly would you have sex with someone? How many people would you have sex with? This is not, don't be thinking this is a gender difference that has disappeared in 2017. It has not. And that's been replicated many times using different methods. How do we explain the results, though? What's going on here? Why does this happen? The principal parental investment is important to understand here. And it's a pretty common explanation given for this. If you think about going into a sexual interaction, what's the minimum investment? What's the potential result of this? An offspring. What's the minimum investment that would be required from the male versus female, just due to biological reality, in order for the offspring that results to potentially survive? Okay, so if you think about it from that perspective, sexes are going to differ on the degree of parental investment or rearing or care that is going to be required of them if conception is to happen after sex takes place. Of course, if you just think about this in terms of what would be the absolute minimum time investment, this is not going to be very much for men. It would be possible for them to produce an offspring that could survive with very little time investment. With women, the minimum here, and this is just the biological reality related to the fact that it is growing inside her womb, of course, is 9 months. She is tied to this in a very physical way for at least that minimum time if it's going to survive. If you think about this disparity in parental investment, that's how people often explain this big difference in male versus female approaches to sex. The idea is that this difference in minimum investment results in differential strategies when selecting for a mate. Men can be less careful. Less investment is required of them based on the results in terms of just the minimum. And women are going to take this with a more careful, more choosy approach. Right? And that kind of makes sense that men who, for much of human history, were willing to mate faster in a less choosy way and with more people, people who just had that instinct to prefer that kind of behavior, if they were male, would have passed on their genes more often than a female who jumped into things with a faster, less choosy approach, because her minimum time to produce one baby is not a 9-month investment. She can't have as many offspring in a life. And if she jumps into an interaction without being at all picky and ends up having a baby with somebody who isn't committed and isn't helping provide resources, we talked about this a little bit last class, then the baby might not be the best off. And what that means is you've got different strategies that might result. Women who just have this instinct to, I want to be a little bit more careful, they might have passed on their genes more often, and as a result, modern day women have descended from those women who had that approach. Now, we're not saying, again, we made this point on Wednesday, that this exists at the conscious level, that people are adopting these strategies because they're consciously thinking about passing on genes. As you know, many people engaging in these interactions today would be doing so with the plan to take very reliable contraception. Clearly, they're not consciously taking these approaches related to procreation, but people who just happen to have the preference or the impulse to operate in this way when relating to the opposite sex, the point is, would have happened to pass on their genes more often. And that's why maybe these instincts are still persisting They've been inherited over time. That's the thought. Okay. So there we go. Minimum parental investment, different mating strategies. It's a really dramatic difference. And of course, we're not saying that environment doesn't impact preferences and approaches to mating at all. We're just saying that one explanation for why across a diverse range of individual experiences we see such a big on average gender difference might be because of something innate that people enter the world with. That's the thought. Let's move on past thinking like evopsychologists to talk a little bit about just this question now of genes versus environment. The whole idea of the evolutionary approach to thinking about human behavior wouldn't be possible if there wasn't some way that these impulses and preferences and traits could be passed down through some physical thing that was inherited that became the physical building blocks of who people were. Natural selection wouldn't work if the people who were more likely to survive and procreate weren't passing the qualities that help them do so down to their offspring, right? That's why you see a species gradually change because of that. And this whole dialogue, the people who first came up with the principles of evolution didn't even necessarily know how that all works specifically and what genes were and what they looked like. They didn't know nearly what we do now. But this whole discussion about that, they had some idea that this idea of heritability was possible. And the whole evolutionary theory conversation couldn't have taken place without just thinking about this question of genes. Okay, we can inherit something physical that contributes to who we are. And who we are is not just what happens to us after we're born. It's maybe something that was determined before the day we were born, in the physical building blocks of who we are. And more generally, what this leads to is a conversation or sort of a debate in the literature about which is the more important determinant of who we are, the physical building blocks we enter the world with or the environment. And that's what we're going to wrap this conversation up with now. We're going to talk a little bit about this discussion about genes versus the environment. Behavioral genetics is the study of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. And you might be thinking, well, how do you know the answer to that? There's different methods that are used. Twin studies, adoption studies are probably two of the most well known. You might have actually heard of these. There are certain individuals that are genetically identical. And what researchers have tried to do is take advantage of that by doing twin studies, and you can do these in different ways. You can look at identical twins who were separated at birth, and you can see, do identical twins who were separated at birth have more in common with one another than siblings who are not identical that were raised in the same home? And if on average the people who share the genes but not the environment are more similar on certain traits than the people who shared the environment but not the genes, then that would help us get some glimpse into this question of maybe which holds the bigger influence over certain kinds of behaviors. Adoption studies can take a similar approach to look at kids who were adopted and look at whether or not their correlation on certain behaviors between them and their biological parents is stronger than between them and the ones that raised them. Again, that would give you some insight into on a particular trait, environment, or genes. What all of these studies are trying to get at is this idea of heritability. How heritable is a given preference or trait or behavior or quality? And this whole conversation, of course, revolves around genes, the biological blueprint for all of these things. Really quick review from maybe a basic bio class. Genes are the biochemical units of heredity. And this is my Do Genes Shape Who We Are cartoon. Your DNA chip will tell us if you have a predisposition to certain illnesses. Our lab techs are trying to isolate the willing to work long hours for little pay gene. This is, of course, a joke, but it's playing off this idea that if we could get good enough at mapping or understanding genes, they are so important in determining who we are, we could predict every little specific thing about a person. I don't know that many people think that that is where we would ever be, that's even possible hypothetically, but it's often the topic of a lot of sci-fi movies. But it gets at, of course, this question: how much do our genes shape who we are versus our experiences? Genes, basic units of heredity, they're essentially thought of as coded instructions to carry out certain genetic characteristics. And chromosomes, of course, are what carry our genes. Just a quick refresher: female contributes an egg that has 23 chromosomes. Male contributes a sperm that has 23 chromosomes, resulting in people having 46 total. You maybe have seen a picture of these in a basic bio class. That's what they look like. And this is what all the fuss is about, essentially. We have these combining from a mom and a dad to produce certain traits. Now, of course, you don't have expressed every single thing that you might have a gene for. If you have a pair of dominant genes, the idea is the dominant trait would be expressed. Dominant and recessive, the dominant trait would still be expressed. Or recessive, the recessive trait would be expressed. Eye color is one example. Most people know that darker eye color is dominant and lighter eye color is recessive. If you're going to have light eyes, you need to get the light eye gene from both your mom and your dad is the idea. But this is a good example, a good time to mention the caution that most human traits, that's actually an oversimplified way of thinking about it, they're influenced by more than one gene. And that's, one reason why, even if in theory we could understand how genes combine to create predictable traits in people, why this is very complicated, because we often don't know all of the genes and how they work together in a way to produce certain traits that are expressed. Okay, so that's your quick kind of Genes 101 recap. This brings us to nature versus nurture. How powerful are these things? How influential are they? How much does this matter? Behavioral genetics is essentially going to attempt to determine how much of our behavior is genetic versus due to the environment. And this line of research is going to be trying to get at heritability, a statistical measure of how much a particular trait is inherited and how much is because of course, any number of other factors. And as I mentioned, twin studies and adoption studies are conducted as ways to discover heritability in humans. Monozygotic twins form from one egg and one sperm that splits, so they're genetically identical. Dizygotic twins are formed by two separate eggs and two separate sperm. It's when a mom releases two eggs 1 month when she ovulates, which is not the norm, but does happen sometimes. And if that happens and both of them are fertilized, then you will have two babies growing at the same time in one womb. Genetically, they will be no more similar than any other siblings because they're coming from two different sperm and two different eggs, but they will be sharing a womb environment, which might have an impact. And when you're doing twin studies, you're taking advantage of the fact that you have these two people that are more genetically similar than other siblings. And you, like I said, you can make all these fun comparisons. You can also compare. A lot of people have argued that the womb has its own influence, and more we have an explosion of research on how what you're exposed to in the womb can permanently change how your genes are expressed. And that means that a lot of people would say, well, how do you know that things that identical twins have in common is actually due to the genes they started with being the same, as opposed to them being exposed to the same elements in the womb, whereas other siblings were not. And that's where the fraternal versus identical twin comparison can be very useful, because fraternal twins also shared the womb. And if you see that identical twins are still showing much higher correlations on certain traits, we can say, okay, this is probably the genes you started with kind of thing. And as I mentioned, adoption studies are also going to be comparing correlations of traits of the adopted children with their biological parents versus their adopted parents. If the correlation is higher with the bio parents, this is going to suggest some heritability of that trait. Now, this is going to depend on the trait. that we are talking about. For this is a really straightforward example. Height is obviously much more heritable than maybe something like specific table manners, which might be more directly taught or modeled by the people around you. And a lot of the research is going to be looking at, well, how heritable is this versus how heritable is this trait? And as you can imagine, that's going to mean there are hundreds of studies done trying to calculate these heritability coefficients for all of these different behaviors and traits. I could teach a whole course in what we know about the heritability of all these different behaviors and traits as a result. We're not going to go over all of it today, but I'll give you a few quick examples. Intelligence. For whatever reason, people are really fascinated by the study of what makes us smart or not. And this is one where people have investigated, does this have a genetic component? A meta-analysis of twins reared both apart and together showed the following correlation rates for intelligence. Monozygotic twins, 0.86. Dizygotic twins, 0.6. That means about 60% have about the same IQ. Regular siblings, 0.46. About 46% have the same IQ. And people who are unrelated, there's, not surprisingly, no correlation in IQ. What does this mean? People think there's a strong genetic link here. People think that IQ definitely is, to a certain extent, inherited. That genes do have an impact on this. The more, if you look at this, the more genetically related you are, the higher the the higher the correspondence in your IQ. What about a totally different domain of human life? Let's take mental disorders. Schizophrenia. Is this inherited? Another meta-analysis of twins reared both apart and together. Correlation rates for schizophrenia. Monozygotic twins, 0.48. That means if one gets it, the other has a 48% chance of also getting it. Dizygotic twins, 0.1. If one gets it, the other has a 10% chance of also getting it. Siblings is about the same as dizygotic twins. Regular siblings. And adoption studies show that those born to schizophrenic mothers but not raised by them had the same 10% risk as those who were raised by them. This again suggests a definite genetic link for schizophrenia. People think that genes are involved in this. But note what percentage it is not for the monozygotic twins. If your identical twin has this or develops this, this doesn't mean you have a 100% chance of developing it. Clearly, there are other things going on that we need to understand. Okay? And I think that's important to remember. Some people think of this in terms of genetic susceptibility, that maybe what you inherit is a genetic susceptibility to develop something, and if you are exposed to the right environmental trigger. And that would be one way that genes would interact with environment and why you wouldn't see 100% correspondence. Homosexuality. This is one that's been talked a lot about recently. I thought I would mention some of the findings here. Inherited. Here's one study done in the early 90s, and the research done around this time shaped a lot of the conversation that then has unfolded in the last decade or so. Identical twin males, 52% concordance in sexuality. Fraternal twin males, only 22%. Unrelated males raised in the same house, 10%. This study's been replicated with similar findings. Yeah, people think there's a genetic link here. It's not 100%, of course. There's some elements that go into determining this outside of just genes that we don't fully understand, of course. Other psychological disorders that have been linked to genetics: alcohol abuse, particularly in males, anxiety disorders, depression, antisocial behavior. So those are just a sampling of some. Now, we're going to wrap this discussion up with a final comment on this whole idea of nature versus nurture. A lot of people say it's a false dichotomy. What do we mean by a false dichotomy? The idea here is that for many years, people were conceiving of this in terms of the following kind of framework. You've got genes that are saying, you're going to be this way. And then you might have experiences that are saying, nope, you're going to be this way. And The question is, which is more powerful? If your genes are coding for this, but your experience is determining this, which is going to win? It's thought of as two football teams at battle on the field. The idea is that one is saying this, go this way, and one is saying go this way, and the stronger one is always going to have control. And that's how the question for many years was kind of framed. We want to know what was more important, what was the stronger factor in determining who we are, which is going to win, right? Genes or nature. And a lot of people say this is a false dichotomy. A dichotomy is when you can categorize something as one or the other. Was that due to nature or was it due to nurture? Okay. You can say that it's either in this category or that category, and everything can be put in one or the other, but they cannot exist in both at the same time. That's what a dichotomy is. A lot of people say this is a false dichotomy. By false dichotomy, what they're saying is it's a misunderstanding of how this all even works to suggest that that should be the question we're asking. Was it nature or was it nurture that made you that way? All right, which was stronger? People instead have now taken a totally different perspective on this. And the more modern or recent opinion is that this question, which one has the bigger effect, which matters more, is not good to be asking. And rather, we should be taking what we call the interactionist perspective, which is that genes interact with environment. The genetic influence on behavior can vary depending on the environment in which we're studying behavior. What that means is we might not even be able to answer the question, how strong is the influence of genes on something, until we know what environment you exist in. And that's what we mean by an interaction. The effect of one factor depends on another factor. You can't just say, how strong of an influence do genes exert? Because it might not be consistent. You might have to first say, well, what environment are you in? Oh, if you're in this environment, genes matter a lot. If you're in this environment, their influence is weakened. And that's what we call an interaction, where the effect of one factor depends on another factor. Using IQ as a quick example, this graph would show both genes and environment having an impact on IQ. Now, I should say as a quick note, I'm just using this as a hypothetical illustration to help you think of this idea of the interactionist perspective, but obviously it's way oversimplified where I have these labels that say good genes, bad genes, good environment, bad environment. That's way oversimplifying the issue, but just for the purposes of visual display. This graph shows that you get a little boost in IQ if you go from having bad genes, the dark purple bar, to good genes, the light purple bar. You can see genes has an impact. This graph also shows that you get a boost from going from a bad environment to a good environment. The bar gets higher when you make that jump. But where do you get the biggest jump? When you go from the bad environment to the good environment. If you had to pick, let's say you wanted a high IQ. If you had to pick, should I be raised in a good environment or should I have good genes? Most people would say, I'm going to pick the good environment because that's what matters more, because I could say I have good genes, but if I end up in a bad environment, look how low my bar will still be. Most people would pick the good environment because that clearly has the bigger effect. This would be what it would look like visually if genes had the bigger effect. Look where you get the biggest leap. Again, both of them, you're seeing an impact. The good gene bar is higher than the bad gene bar, and the good environment bars are higher than the bad environment bars, but you get the biggest leap when you go from bad genes to good genes. This graph is showing genes having the bigger effect. And whether it was the last graph you just saw or this one was much of the nature versus nurture debate. But more recently, as I said, people have observed, well, actually, it could be this. This graph shows that in one environment, genes, good genes, can give you an edge. They have an effect. But in another environment, they don't actually have any effect. In other words, the effect of genes depends on whether you're in a good and bad environment. If you see, look at the bad environment. The people who enter the world with better genes on the IQ front, on average, are not ending up with any higher IQ than the ones that have worse genes. If you're in a bad environment, it seems like genes don't have any impact at all. If you're in a good environment, it seems like they do. And that's why you can't say, is it genes or environment? You have to say, well, the effect of genes might depend on the environment. And I use this as an example because there actually is some research that suggests that maybe IQ might work this way. That if you are born into a really bad, impoverished environment where you're not getting the basic social connections or physical contact or stimulation that you need to have your brain even develop during those critical years to its full, I guess, genetic potential, you can think of it that way, then having good genes doesn't really seem to give you an edge. Okay? It just kind of is leaving everyone a little bit more equally bad off, is the thought. But if you get somebody into a good enough environment, then genes do seem to determine some differences. Like, as long as I meet the minimum threshold for letting my brain develop to its genetic potential, then if you enter the world with better genes, you're going to have a little bit of an edge in terms of where you're going to end up on IQ. Some research suggests that maybe this is actually how IQ works, and that's why I use it as an example. That wraps up our conversation about nature versus nurture. I want to move on to talking about the nervous system, and we're going to finish up with the nervous system and then the parts of the brain on Monday. Just a note, this is where things are going to get a little bit involved in terms of memorizing parts of physical structures, and it's easy to get overwhelmed as you look at all of these pictures. I think just keep in mind that the reason why we're doing this is because it really is important to remember that humans' psychological processes are hugely influenced by the physical structures that underlie them. And we need to understand the basics of some of those critical physical structures to really get that, to see how what we know about how the brain works and how hormones work, etc., how nerves work, has really supported a lot of psychological theories and impacted what we know about human psychology. And that's why it's really important to get this part of the picture. I don't want you to get too nervous about all the physical parts you have to memorize. I'm going to walk you through some of the critical things about a nerve, so after you do your reading, maybe it will help simplify some of it a little bit to review it in this way, to hear it presented in just a slightly new way. And then we're going to talk about the brain. The same purpose. My hope is that if you do your reading once and then we discuss it in class and you hear it again in a slightly new way, that's just really going to help you with these questions on the test. And keep in mind, stick to that study guide. You don't have to memorize every label on every picture in your book. Don't do that or waste time on that unnecessarily. No, focus on what your study guide says you have to know. I'm going to upload before Monday also a sheet on the parts of the brain before we get there, to aid your review as you prepare for the test. Basically, it's going to be a list of the parts of the brain you might be tested over with a really quick kind of shortcut reminder of what each of the parts are involved in and what they do. And hopefully that'll help your review. All these things I'm trying to do just to help you kind of get more of a handle this and not be on this and not be overwhelmed by the material. On that note, let's jump into a brief discussion of the nervous system with the time that we have left today. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the nerves that connect the CNS to the rest of the body. We are going to be going over divisions of the nervous system. This is the most basic division that we start with. I want you to make sure that as we walk through this, you could kind of picture the tree in your head. Okay, this is how it's first divided, and then it is broken up into these further subdivisions. And if you get a quiz or exam question about this part of the nervous system is a part of what part of the nervous system, make sure you have a good handle on that. CNS, the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral, the nerves that connect the brain and the spinal cord to the rest of the body. We're going to further now break down the peripheral nervous system, because that's a lot of nerves involved there, all the nerves that connect this to the rest of the body, and we further categorize them into the somatic nervous system, the nerves under conscious control, and the autonomic nervous system, the ones that control involuntary actions. This is an important distinction because there's something fundamentally different involved in the processes of voluntary and involuntary actions. If you are sitting in a class and you decide you want to answer a question and you make the decision to put your hand up, that is going to be a motor movement that is under your conscious control, and the nerves of the somatic nervous system will be involved in sending that message from your brain to your arm in order to execute that action. If, however, you're going to have your heart beating while you're sitting in class, that's going to involve nerves of the autonomic nervous system. Thankfully, with everything you have to focus on while you're listening to what's happening in class and everything else you have to think about, you don't have to consciously will your heart to beat or make that decision. That is an involuntary action, though nerves are still passing the message that's necessary to keep that going on. It's just not under your conscious control. You don't will it each time to beat. And that's a good thing for the most part, because think of the cognitive load that we would be under if we had to consciously will all of these things to happen. There are a lot of things that are not under our conscious control. The autonomic nervous system has two further subdivisions. We divide it into the sympathetic nervous system. Sorry. It was Mr. Darcy. I'll come back in 1 second. The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Let's start with the sympathetic nervous system. The nerves involved here activate our internal organs during times of stress and arousal. You might have heard of the fight or flight response. The idea is that if everything is going as normal, our internal organs kind of have this default resting state. Then if all of a sudden, for example, you were to encounter a bear while walking through the woods, alarms would kind of go off. Your system would react. Your systems would say, wait a minute, we have to get geared up to respond in some way here. This might pose a threat. This seems alarming. And we have to essentially execute what we call either a fight response, come up with kind of a way to cope with this in the moment, or a flight response, which is check out as a method of dealing with it. For example, here's Mr. Darcy. He looks ferocious. He's terrifying. And if you are a cat and your day is going as normal, you're hanging around, purring, doing whatever cats do, and then all of a sudden Mr. Darcy appears on the scene. This is going to activate a set of unique processes as your body gears up the fight or flight response, because clearly you need to exit your default state here. Something needs to happen because, I mean, look at Mr. Darcy. He's terrifying. The parasympathetic nervous system then reverses things back to normal, returns the body back to this default state. If you look at the two names here, sympathetic and parasympathetic, my hope is that you could see, okay, these complement each other in some way, so this will be easy to remember. This is just an example. You might be thinking, well, what exactly happens? What are we talking about here? Of some of the things that might be involved. You're walking through a forest, you see a bear. Your default state wouldn't be to have your pupils be super dilated, but that's going to happen in order to prepare you for this kind of fight or flight response. Then the parasympathetic nervous system would be responsible for constricting your pupil. The sympathetic nervous system would do things like accelerate your heart, whereas then the parasympathetic nervous system would slow it back down. Your sympathetic nervous system would inhibit digestion. So you could engage in this fight or flight, and your parasympathetic would then stimulate your normal digestion processes. Those are just a few examples. All right, this is that tree I was talking about. This picture I want you to have in your head. A quick review. Be aware of the divisions we just talked about. We've got the central nervous system versus the peripheral. And then the peripheral nervous system is further broken into autonomic versus somatic, voluntary, involuntary actions, and the autonomic system, the involuntary ones, can be further broken down into parasympathetic, calming, and sympathetic, arousing. I want to talk now a little bit more about the structure that's at the heart of this system, the neuron. And the neuron is really important, and that's why I think it is useful to have a basic understanding of the physical structures involved here. A neuron is a specialized cell that conducts impulses through the nervous system, and as you'll see here, the kind of what we know about a neuron and how it works has impacted a lot of important things, all the way to how we treat psychological disorders. When things are kind of happening outside of the ordinary with a neuron and how it passes messages, we develop medications that to try to work on that. We'll see that here. Get a little bit more into that on Monday. But a neuron is a specialized cell. And the basic parts of it you need to be familiar with. We've got the cell body, we've got the dendrites, which receive the message from another neuron, and then the axon, which sends the message out to the next neuron. The terminal button is that nub at the end of the axon, where the message is sent out. This is a picture of it. You can see we've got the cell body. The dendrites look like tree branches very appropriately. They look like they're kind of reaching out to help receive that message and bring it in. And then you've got the axon, which is the long, thin part here, where the neuron is able to then send the message out onto the next neuron. And you can see the terminal button at the end of the axon. I have a link here for you. This is kind of silly. It's this silly little neuron song. If you just want to remember these basic structures involved in a neuron, the ones on your study guide that you're supposed to know, and you're having trouble remembering it, you can play this if you want. It's this silly little chant. But sometimes seeing a visual and hearing a little chant helps you get it in your head. I put that link in there in case it helps you. We're going to talk next time about, now that you have the basic structures down, what goes on in a synapse, and how does this message passing process work, and why is that so important? And then we'll do a little demonstration. We're going to form a human neuron chain on Monday, and that's something to look forward to. Hooray! And we'll move on to talking about the brain after that. That wraps things up. Thank you so much for listening to me in this format, for bearing with me. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you all next time on Monday.